he jumped into Normandy with the 6th Airborne on D-Day, which is an extraordinary thing for any journalist to do. I always find it difficult to imagine that happening today.
I'm David Knowles, and this is Battle Lines.
I've made wartime decisions. I know the choices are never clear or easy for the leadership.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
80 years ago, British, American and Canadian troops landed in Normandy. It was the start of the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi Germany. Thousands of soldiers died on D-Day and in the following months as the Allies forced the German army out of France. On today's episode of Battle Lines, we mark and reflect on this anniversary, and we ask what it means for Western countries in 2024 as another full-scale war ravages Europe. We hear from the Telegraph's US editor Tony Diver, who's been following Joe Biden's visit to Normandy. We also speak to our defence editor Danielle Sheridan, who's been talking to veterans on the ground in France. In the studio in London, I catch up with Roland Oliphant, who's been exploring some of the journalism from D-Day, and we talk about what it means about the coverage of war then and now. Finally, we speak to Asia correspondent Nicola Smith, who's starting a new reporting stint in Israel. It's Friday, the 7th of June, 2024. First, let's go to our US editor Tony Diver, who's in Normandy.
We know the dark forces that these heroes fought against 80 years ago. They never fade. The struggle between a dictatorship and freedom is unending.
Monsieur John Wardle, au nom de la République française.
I'm Tony Diver, I'm the Telegraph's US editor. Today I've been at the American cemetery in Normandy. That's just over from Omaha Beach, where famously American troops landed on D-Day and where 2,500 casualties were taken in a single day. What we heard there were two speeches, one from Joe Biden himself and one from Emmanuel Macron, in which both men praised the bravery and sacrifice of those who were killed and also those who had made it and are still alive today. We saw actually what I found to be quite a surprising number of American veterans who were brought forward, most of whom in wheelchairs, but some of whom managed to stand and put on the stage in front of a crowd of thousands and applauded for the service that they gave during the Second World War. On the political end, what we also saw was some quite interesting phrasing from the US president, in which he talked about the dangers of isolationism. He talked about the dangers of repeating the mistakes of the past in allowing authoritarians to take over allied states, and he referred explicitly to the war in Ukraine, where he compared Putin's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 to the Nazi occupation of France. What I think we got a little bit of was actually some implied criticism of Donald Trump, who he's running against in November's presidential election. Donald Trump has said repeatedly that he thinks that we should end the war in Ukraine on day one of his presidency, which is assumed to carry with it some territorial losses by Ukraine to Russia, and that we should cut back American political, military and financial support to Ukraine because of the cost that it has, he argues, on domestic policy back at home. Joe Biden was extremely clear in his rejection of that message. He said that we should treat the dangers of Vladimir Putin's Russia in exactly the same way as America and allies did in the 1940s when faced with the threat of Nazi Germany, and said that he wanted Americans to rally behind him in supporting Ukraine going forward. I think that was a surprisingly political speech, actually, for an event which is usually considered to be relatively apolitical. Of course, you would expect a US president in these circumstances to be talking about the power of freedom and democracy and the importance of standing up against foreign aggressors. But I think perhaps in the current climate and in the election context that we find ourselves, what it sounded like was a bit more of a campaign speech. But the ceremony went on for several hours. We saw dozens and dozens of these veterans. We also had two flypasts, which was a treat for those plane lovers among us. We had 4 C-130s and 4 F-35s. So that was pretty exciting, and it was all finished off with a 21-gun salute across Omaha Beach, leading into an international ceremony where Mr. Macron, Mr. Biden and the King will all meet on the beach this afternoon. So I think a pretty interesting afternoon, both in terms of the history that we learnt, what we saw in terms of the political messaging from Mr. Biden, and in terms of the seriousness with which both France and the US take the commemoration on this 80th anniversary, which, as we are repeatedly told by those here rather sadly, will likely be the last major milestone that those veterans will see.
Thank you so much, Tony. Staying in France, here's our defence editor Danielle Sheridan, who's been speaking to veteran Ken Hay, who arrived in Normandy 20 days after the first landings. He was among the troops sent over as reinforcements in the battle for Western France.
Well, in the war, we sailed down from Southampton, but it was too rough to land the other side. We were supposed to go over about D+11, but by the time it cooled down, and it still wasn't, so it was still rough. By the time we got over there, it was about D20. We landed. And we landed on Juno Beach, which was originally the Canadian beach. Our division, which was the 43rd Wessex Division, were given the task of capturing an area called Hill 112. It's very famous in military language because it's not a hill as you think. It's a piece of rising ground southwest of Caen. And Rommel, who was in charge of the German forces, he said, whoever holds 112 holds Normandy. When you get to the top of it, as it were, on the high ground, you can see for miles in all directions. So military-wise, you could see troop movements, you could see tanks, you could see fires, smoke, any aerodrome that was there, you'd see where the planes were landing. It's a very important piece of land. On the night of the 7th, which was a Friday, and through to the 8th, our platoon, which was 30 men, was sent out on a night patrol, ostensibly to blow up a self-propelled gun which was in no man's land. In fact, it wasn't in no man's land, as we found out, because there were two lines of defence. We were trapped, we couldn't go back, we couldn't go forward. So a battle started, and that went on for several hours.
Do you remember how you felt during the battle?
Mostly fright, but it was all a mixture. There's no one emotion, you know. I mean, when you're laying out there and seemingly defenceless because you can't see your target, and at that stage you've got two prayers. One is, Lord, keep me safe, and the other one is, if it's my number's on it, let it be quick. Anyway, the long and short of it all, and I didn't find out until I knew 5 of us got captured out of 30. I didn't know until I got back a year later, because my brother was one of the 16 that got back. He was a corporal, 4 years older than me, my older brother Bill. 16 got back, 5 of us got captured, so presumably 9 were killed.
When you were captured in Poland, you were made to work in the Polish mines.
Yes.
Along with other British troops that had been captured.
And Russian. There were Russians down there.
What kept you going each day? You know, did you ever feel despair?
Well, to some extent, it was a day after day of doing the same thing, and so you just had to do it and tried to get some food and tried to get some sleep. I was captured on the 8th of July. I was released by the Americans on the 22nd of April.
A long time.
We were liberated by the Americans. We were flown to Reims in northern France, and it was surrounded by barbed wire. When we got there, outside the building, we had to strip everything off except our pants. And there were Jerry's forking it away to burn all out here, because they were all out with heat and so on. And then we stepped inside and we had a shower. You have no idea. I can't possibly explain what that shower. We were there for 2 or 3 days, and then they said, we're going home tomorrow. And we landed at Dunsfold in Surrey on the 4th of May. We were given a telegram to send home to say we were in England and we'd be home on the Sunday. And on the Sunday morning, we were taken up to Waterloo and went home. And my mum had got the telegram and she told the whole world Eddie was coming home. Even the milkman, because in those days milkman was delivered on the doorstep. And I didn't know who it was. As I told my road, I saw a man walking away from my house. I knew it wasn't my dad. And he stopped and looked and turned back and rapped on the door and said to one of our sisters, "Is this your brother?" And I see my little mum running down the road. I could still see her. I was home. That was it. Right.
You're making me cry.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
I met Ken Hay when I travelled from Portsmouth to Caen in Normandy with veterans that had served in D-Day. It was organised by the Royal British Legion, and it really was a sight to behold. You had all of these veterans in their late 90s embarking on what might be their final trip to Normandy to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings. It was really special. In fact, it was an honour to talk to these veterans. I found Ken's story particularly moving, just hearing about what it was like as a young boy to be sent off to war, not knowing what would happen to his family, what would be of the world he had known. And it, for me, was the moment he described finally coming home and seeing his parents leaving the house and running up the street calling his name that just got me. It was so emotional, and to think that moment happened 80 years ago, but the vividness of that memory is still inked on his brain, and it just goes to show how formative this experience was for so many people. It wasn't something that can be pushed to one side of the brain and forgotten. Or maybe it is, that's a survival method that they've used to cope. You know, when these young men came out of war, young men and women came out of war, PTSD wasn't a thing. Having decompression, a period of decompression, wasn't known or exercised really. You just, you put up and carried on. And it goes to show that when these veterans want to remember, there is a part of their memory that they can tap into, and then it's there as bright as anything, and it's still so moving for them and for us and listeners like myself. I really was touched to hear it. But most importantly, as I said, these veterans, they're in their late 90s. They're not going to be around for all that much longer. And that's why it remains so important to keep telling their stories, because we've been so fortunate to have this oral history. And now without it, the onus is on journalists and historians and family members and schools to keep telling their stories so that we don't forget what came before.
Thank you so much, Danielle. Of course, it wasn't just soldiers who went over to France on the first day and days of the campaign in France. Roland Oliphant, our senior foreign correspondent, has been looking at some of the journalists who were covering the campaign. Here's their stories. Can we start, Roland, just by talking about some of the journalists who were on the ground and in the air? Who have you been looking at?
I've been looking at 3 people who've caught my eye. One of them because he worked for us, so I thought that's appropriate. And 2 others because I think they're very rare in that they were journalists who were on the ground doing the real frontline stuff on D-Day itself or on D-Day +1, which was actually quite rare. Like most journalists, Ernest Hemingway, for example, he watched the Omaha beach landings from an American destroyer or a British destroyer, an Allied destroyer, but he didn't get onto the ground. Our guy actually watched it. He managed to get a seat on a B-26 bomber, and he was able to look at what was happening that evening and was able to file a colour dispatch for the June the 7th paper. But he didn't set foot in Normandy till August. Richard Dimbleby, the BBC guy, he was covering it from an airfield. So there are lots of dispatches about paratroopers getting onto aircraft. Quite few who were actually on the beach. In no particular order, just the order I've written them down. One is called Guy Byam. Now, he's a BBC man. He'd been in a merchant marine. He'd been invalided out after his ship was sunk, was looking around for another job, and he found one at the BBC and became a war reporter. And the remarkable thing about this guy is that somehow, and I'm not quite sure how, he persuaded the 6th Airborne Division, the British paratroopers, to take him along. He jumped into Normandy with the 6th Airborne on D-Day, which is an extraordinary thing for any journalist to do. And I always find it difficult to imagine that happening today. The second one is our own man, Cornelius Ryan. Cornelius Ryan was the Telegraph special correspondent. He was, like Richard Dimbleby, like a lot of the journalists, he was covering it from airfields in Britain. That was the access he could get. By evening, he was up in a B-26 bomber flying over Normandy, and he describes this just sea of aircraft and a sea of sea, and below him he can see the fighters. Very, very colourful dispatch. But he wrote in our June the 7th issue, he wrote quite a really good piece, I think, which was talking about the ground crew he saw at the airbase. This is just one thing from his dispatch. Remember, he's watching this from an airbase in England. Yet perhaps the most important men, the men who receive no publicity and are mostly streaked marks of sooty oil, are the men who keep the machines in the air. The men who worked all that night pointing to the now famous zebra stripes onto the mighty bombers that hammered the coastline. The men who mended the broken ships and changed the engines throughout that night. They were the men who came rushing up to the pilot as soon as he landed with the familiar, eager words on the lips. "Was she all right, sir?" If you look into World War II journalism, there's actually a lot of this stuff, and we forget about it, and we do forget about these guys. Everybody who's not at the front, that the way there was this enormous machine, and that's still true in any kind of war you report these days, you know. The last journalist I want to highlight is Martha Gellhorn, who probably needs no introduction, one of the most famous war correspondents of the 20th century. Her D-Day dispatch didn't actually appear until August in the American magazine Collier's. I first came across it, I was reading an anthology of her work, and I just thought, I'm so jealous. This is one of the best dispatches I've ever read. And what's remarkable about it is that she basically tricked her way onto a hospital ship where she wasn't meant to be. So she didn't have accreditation. She found a way through the security cordon. She got onto a hospital ship. She had a bit of medical training. I think her dad was a doctor or something, so she was able to kind of chip in with the nurses. And she ended up landing on Omaha Beach. There's a bit of debate. I think if you read it, it's pretty clear she landed on June the 7th, on the morning of June the 7th. Some people say she landed on D-Day itself. But I think if you read the piece, it's quite clear. She's talking about getting on shore on the June the 7th to start bringing people out.
Yeah, I think you're right. I agree with you on that. Well, let's have a look at her piece. It's called The Wounded Come Home. As you said, the American magazine Collier's. It comes out August the 5th, 1944. So this is several months after the events described. It really brings home the absolutely huge amount of organisation and bureaucracy and planning that D-Day required. So she's on one hospital ship. There are 6 nurses aboard, all American, none of whom knew what they were doing. It's sort of unclear whether this was kept from them or whether they were put on this hospital ship as a new assignment. So just to read out that section, there were 6 nurses aboard, and they were fine girls. They came from Texas and Michigan and California and Wisconsin. And 3 weeks ago, they were in the USA completing their training for this overseas assignment. They had been prepared to work on a hospital train, which would mean caring for wounded in sensible, steady railway carriages. Instead, they found themselves on a ship, and they were about to move across the dark waters of the Channel. So even on one ship amongst the hundreds of ships on D-Day, quite a few of the people on it don't know what's happening, and everything has to be planned to the minute. Everything has to be organised. As you said, back home at the aerodromes, you've got hundreds of people working on the planes, keeping them in the air. You've also got the hundreds of people behind the medical evacuation and the medical care. So I thought, if we throw forward then from D-Day and we think the fact that this was a surprise. Germans did not know this was coming until it was too late. The amount of... D-Day was the largest seaborne operation of its kind. The next biggest in the future would be a Chinese assault on Taiwan. The kind of issues that we see in this piece and the kind of questions it throws up about secrecy, about preparation, about the immense bureaucracy needed to pull something like this off and to do so without your enemy knowing, I feel like we're in a slightly different world. We published a piece on the Telegraph last week about news that China is buying up, not landing craft, but ferries for trucks, purportedly for trucks, potentially for tanks. So we already know that's happening. Or we think that's happening. Zaluzhny, in his essay on the Ukraine war last year in The Economist, talked about how, for him, the battlefield was transparent, that the Russians knew everything the Ukrainians were doing, that the Ukrainians knew everything the Russians were doing, that the ability to pull off an operation on this size, it feels in today's world that this would be far more difficult. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that's absolutely right. I think there's 2 things that leap out from that section, as you say. She says, these nurses thought they were going to be working on a hospital train in England, and then suddenly they're told we're going to get on a ship, and they didn't, they've just arrived on a ship, but fine, they take it in their stride. Now, that either means, as you say, they weren't told until the last minute because of operational secrecy, or it could be that, plans change very, very quickly in war, and you've just got to respond to it. And often the people at the bottom don't know whether that's cock-up, conspiracy, planning, or whatever else. But, I think you're absolutely right. A lot has been written about the deception plans around D-Day. There's a good... We can draw a parallel here between D-Day and what happened in Ukraine last year, right? These are both offensives that everybody knew what was going to happen, and everybody knew more or less where it was going to land. Like in it had to happen in that part of Ukraine, really, roughly, exactly where no one knew.
This is the Ukrainian counteroffensive.
This is the Ukrainian counteroffensive in 2023. So the Russians were able to prepare. They didn't know where along that line that attack would happen. It's kind of similar. Everybody knew that the Western allies were going to open a second front in Europe, and the Germans were waiting for it. And there's this big debate: where's it going to be? And a lot of the deception was persuading the Germans it was going to be up in Calais instead of in Normandy. So that that whole fake army was created. George Patton was put in charge of the fake army because the Germans thought, well, they're only going to put like that guy in charge of the real thing, right? The French resistance activity in the run-up to D-Day, or blowing up railway lines, cutting telephone lines and stuff like that, a lot of that happened up near Calais to make the Germans think that's where the real stuff is going to happen. It was an absolutely enormous deception operation. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the battlefields, modern battlefields, as Ukraine has demonstrated, are basically transparent. How you could possibly replicate that kind of uncertainty, I don't know. I mean, one option would be, of course, to kind of repeat that thing, that create those options. Everyone knows it's going to happen, but how is it going to happen? I can see the Chinese perhaps pursuing that kind of policy. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it would be incredibly difficult to hide, preparations for a seaborne invasion of this scale these days.
I mean, in the same way that when the Russians were massing on the border ahead of 2022, you can't hide the fact that even Google Street Maps was showing, there's huge delays, there's huge traffic jams along all these sort of arteries heading into Ukraine. So everybody could see it was coming. What we didn't know was whether the order to go ahead would be given.
Yeah, so the debate was, okay, has the political decision been made? And there was lots of debate. It turns out, the Western security services knew exactly that, they had brilliant penetration. They knew the order had been prepared, and it seems like they had a good idea of where the attacks were going to be. But you remember, we could see these troop concentrations, where they're going to go, lots of debates, different arrows on maps, things like that.
One other thing to pull out, I think, from Martha Gellhorn's piece is the importance of medical care. She writes, I think this is the first night of D-Day. Once the wounded starts being loaded onto the ship, and once the nurses and the doctors start doing their work, she writes, from 2:00 one afternoon until the ship docked in England again the next evening at 7, none of the medical personnel stopped work. And besides plasma and blood transfusions, redressing of wounds, examinations, administering of sedatives, or opiates, or oxygen, and all the rest, operations were performed all night long. Only one soldier died on that ship, and he had come aboard as a hopeless case. I thought that was absolutely fascinating, and it showed the importance of a well-stocked, well-prepared, well-trained, and crucially unharried and unbothered medical team. They're not bombed. There's some bombing that happens later on, but they're not attacked. They can operate, they can do their work in relative safety, although it's uncomfortable, and there's lots of soldiers sort of on every single bunk. But only if that's correct, only one soldier died. That's an incredible achievement by that hospital ship, and it made me think of some of the work done by some fantastic Ukrainian journalists on the huge issues of medical evacuations on the front lines in Ukraine. So I'm thinking specifically of Osama Tereyema's piece in the Kiev Independent a few months ago, which we brought her on to talk about this on the Ukraine the Latest podcast, about how the Ukrainians were finding huge problems being able to evacuate wounded soldiers, partly because Russians are quite happy to attack ambulances near the front line with drones and artillery. So lots of medical personnel are being killed, partly because the terrain is very difficult, so it takes a long time to get a wounded soldier from a forward position back to somewhere where they can be stabilized, and then back again to somewhere where they can be treated properly. And it was just interesting, there was exactly the same issues coming up. And another thing that Ukrainians face is a lack of material, right? A lack of cars to actually do these evacuations, a lack of personnel able to do it. So you can see the same issues popping up. One in 1944, today, the last few years in Ukraine. I thought that was quite interesting. The Allies didn't have total air supremacy on D-Day, but they had superiority. They were roughly, relatively in control of the skies. These hospital ships are able to operate without being interfered with, and could dash back to England and bring people to relative safety. And that's just not the case in 2024 in Ukraine. One interesting thing I think to speak about a little bit as well is the limitations of journalism on this day. I mean, D-Day was absolutely huge, and we've talked about 3 correspondents. One of whom was on a hospital ship, one of whom was in a bomber, one of whom was at an airbase. The entire war, the entire operation is obviously far bigger than that, and there's lots. These people give us what they can see, but there's a lot else outside of vision. As you said, Martha Gellhorn's piece comes out in August, and several months after. I mean, Roland, you mentioned earlier When you come into the Telegraph, you can see our front page from the day after D-Day.
It's very interesting to walk past it because it's got one of those battlefield graphics that we still love to do. You know, can you put an arrow on this? You know, can we show so on and so forth? It's obviously being done quickly. And you look at it, and it's stuff that we know is kind of inaccurate now, right? It says, you know, kind of parachute drops reported here, where we know now there weren't any parachutes. There's heavy fighting reported inside Con. We know that the Allies didn't get to Con for several weeks. You can actually imagine how this happened in the newsroom, right? Okay, they've been waiting for this big event. It would have been like preparing for something like the death of the Queen, right? Everyone knew that the invasion was going to happen. People had accredited correspondence. Finally, it's happening. What's happening? Okay, what can we say? What do we know? These are the reports we're getting back. They're a bit confused. And then you get them in the paper. But as you say, that's always, even today, that's hazy, that's first draft of history stuff, like, you know, little errors get in. You're not going to have a full grasp of the picture. And the correcting of that picture is kind of slower because there's no internet back then, right? You know, as you say, kind of Martha Gellhorn's remarkable first-person piece doesn't appear for 2 months, basically.
It makes me wonder what we're missing in Ukraine. It's a 1,000-mile front line. We can't look at everything all the time. The battlefield might be transparent for the soldiers, but it's certainly not for the journalists. We have to rely to some extent on what the military let us know, which might not be the full picture. Often, I think it isn't. Sometimes we have to rely on our stint, our open source investigation teams, think tanks, and we can only see what we can see. There's a lot going on that will only come at us in the next few years, and I think part of our job is to try and work out what we. You know, it's that Donald Rumsfeld thing, isn't it? What does he talk about? Known unknowns? Or
there's unknown unknowns and known unknowns and all of that. Yeah. I mean, I think this is something I've always said in my own career when I've done war reporting is I've always noticed, like, I really don't know what's going on beyond that, out of my line of sight. You know, you can report with great clarity about the things you see and the witness stuff, and I think that's the real strength of this kind of journalism. I think Martha Gellhorn was an absolute master of that kind of reporting. Beyond that, you don't know. Like, militaries don't want to know. Martha Gellhorn, right, is denied accreditation, probably largely because she's a woman. And so kind of with the exception of Guy Byam, like the best access we get is somebody who hasn't played by the rules. I mean, her story about how she got the access is great. She goes, well, I just decided I'm not missing this show. So she drives down from London towards Portsmouth. And, you know, when she stopped at the checkpoint, she goes, I'm a journalist. Yeah, I'm here to do the women's angle. Medical staff or maybe like she says the way she got access was to say, I'm here to do the woman's angle. And everyone thought, okay, well, that's nothing. It's not going to be anything to do with the secret stuff or the real stuff. And that's how she wasn't stopped. You know, if she was a man, I'm going to hold on a second, son. You know, no hacks around here. And that's how she snuck on and how she got that, you know, really unique access.
Finally, let's leave the past behind us and go to Israel, where our Asia correspondent Nicola Smith is starting a new reporting trip. Here's our conversation. Nicola, it's really good to hear from you in Jerusalem. Can we start by looking at Israel's northern border? What's the latest from there?
The latest is that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has threatened an extremely powerful response to attacks by Hezbollah from Lebanon. These attacks have recently escalated. The Prime Minister was in the north of Israel yesterday, and he gave some very strong statements there. He said, anyone who thinks that they can harm us and we will sit on our hands is sorely mistaken. He said that we're prepared for a very strong action in the north and that in one way or another, we will restore security to the north. And what we've seen there is that there has been a constant exchange of fire in the north with anti-Israeli forces based in southern Lebanon since October 7th. There have been reports of well over 3,000 projectiles launched towards Israel from Lebanon since the start of the war. And this has come under a fresh spotlight in the last few days, in the last week or so, after a wave of attacks from Hezbollah set off major fires, which have been raging across the north. And these have been worsened by dry and powerful winds. And so some 3,500 acres of land have been destroyed. And that's really been making headlines in Israel. So the Prime Minister went to the north to address this. His statement followed a statement on Tuesday by the chief of the Israel Defense Forces, Herzi Halevi, who said that we're approaching the point at which we'll have to make a decision and that the IDF is ready for an offensive. So that's the latest, and nobody really knows which way this is going to go. Tens of thousands of people have been displaced from their homes on both sides of the border since October, and many of them have really given up hope in returning to the near future, and they are upset at the government for its lack of a resolution, although many believe that a ceasefire in Gaza would actually help the situation in the north, and that is the way forward. There is a question at the moment of whether this is going to open up a new front for Israel, and that's really unclear at the moment. It could be a negotiating tactic on Israel's part, or a threat to try and get Hezbollah to stop firing into Israel. And it does seem that nobody really wants to open up a new front, including Hezbollah. Yesterday, Hezbollah's deputy chief, Sheikh Naim Qassem, told Al Jazeera that the group wasn't seeking to widen the conflict with Israel, but that any Israeli expansion of the war would be met with devastation. He also said that the Lebanon front would not stop until the Gaza war stops. So it's all very closely linked to whether a ceasefire deal can be agreed over Gaza. And then if it's not, then we could be seeing a lot more action on the northern border with Lebanon.
And Nikki, you've just arrived in Israel to cover the country, to cover this conflict for the Telegraph. What are some of your first impressions on having arrived, and how maybe are they different to what maybe you expected to find?
Well, I just arrived on Wednesday from South Korea, so my first impressions are overshadowed by jet lag. And I arrived in Jerusalem on Wednesday morning. One of the first things that really struck me at Ben Gurion Airport was, as you go towards the immigration line, there are posters of the hostages and posters of the missing. They're all hung up down a long strip that you have to walk down. So it's quite a moving welcome to Israel, to see all of these faces, people who are still being held in Gaza. My impressions after that was that there seemed to be a lot of guns everywhere, more than I feel like I've seen in other conflict zones. I've covered Afghanistan, Iraq, Ukraine before, but there seemed to be just a lot of guns everywhere, not just security forces, not just the police, but that's something that kind of jumped out at me. I arrived in Jerusalem on possibly one of the most tense days since October 7th. Yesterday was Jerusalem Day, or Flag Day, and that's when a lot of Israelis commemorate the conclusion of the 1967 war and the takeover of the West Bank, the Israeli takeover of the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And so there were thousands of people marching through Old Jerusalem, and there were some very tense scenes there. There were a few local journalists who were attacked by the marchers, and it was a kind of really, it was just a very tense atmosphere. People were very on edge. There were a lot of police around, and it was quite an unusual first day in Jerusalem.
And just finally, Nikki, now you're there, what kind of stories will you be looking at initially? Where will you be going? What will you be hoping to cover?
Well, I'll certainly be spending the first few days looking at the situation in the north and whether that conflict there is going to escalate, or whether it is actually going to be resolved through some kind of diplomacy or through a ceasefire deal. We're looking at what's going to happen with the proposed ceasefire deal, whether it's going to go ahead. There have been indications today that Hamas has rejected it because they're saying it doesn't include a permanent end to the war in Gaza. So over the next few days, that's going to be a major story. Also looking at internal politics. Benny Gantz, one of the War Cabinet members, he has previously given a deadline of the 8th of June to say that he would step out of that cabinet and return to the opposition if Netanyahu did not come up with a long-term solution for Gaza. So we'll be looking to see what he does over the next couple of days and whether that's going to destabilize the government. And just more generally looking at also the situation in the West Bank and what is happening there, some updates from the West Bank.
Well, thank you so much, Nikki, for your time. Is there anything we haven't spoken about that you would like to mention just before we finish this?
One thing I would like to mention on the Northern Front is that there is a concern that if conflict intensifies there are fears about what that could mean for Israel, for Israeli cities, that Hezbollah is much better armed, that it's a much stronger enemy, and that this could cause real disruption within Israel, in Tel Aviv, Haifa. And so that is certainly one thing that the Israelis will be taking into consideration when they're talking about possibly launching an offensive in the north. And it's certainly something that the Americans will be talking to them about as well.
Nicola Smith in Jerusalem, thank you so much for your time.
That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.